researchers are increasingly collaborating with nonprofits, NGOs, and governmental entities. And new ethical questions are arising about funding, priorities, and responsibilities. And we're going to untangle all of these questions, maybe bring up some extra questions throughout the discussion today. I'm delighted to have our panelists. Joining us from NYU is Jamie Levine Daniel, who's a native Clevelander. Dr. Levine Daniel is the Henry and Marilyn Taub Foundation Associate Professor of Nonprofit Management and Public Service at the New York University Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. It's like a lot of names. Thanks so much, Dr. Levine Daniel, for coming. And Dr. Levine Daniel's research interests focus on nonprofit resource acquisition and service delivery within the context of power, policy, process, and practice. We also have two Ohio State panelists. Emma Saunders-Hastings is an associate professor of the Department of Political Science at OSU. Dr. Saunders-Hastings is a political theorist whose research focuses on political, economic, and social inequality, with a particular attention to the role of private power. We'll see power is going on a lot in a lot of people's research today. Her book on private virtues, public vices, philanthropy, and democratic equality was published at University of Chicago Press in 2022. And she is currently working on a project related to dirty money. We also have Kenny Steinman, senior research scientist at the Department of Human Sciences in the Ohio State University's College of Education and Human Ecology. Much of Dr. Steinman's work focuses on elder mistreatment and the intersection with the health policy. And throughout Dr. Steinman's work, there's an emphasis on collaboration amongst researchers and practitioners. He directs this project to strengthen quality insurance efforts of Ohio's Adult Protective Services Program, and is on the research committee for the Ohio Elder Abuse Commission, and helps direct the APS Administrative Data Initiative of the National Adult Protective Service Association research to practice interest groups. So I'm so delighted to have the four of you here. Just for folks who are new to these conversations, the way that it's going to work is we're going to have Jamie present first, sort of give us an overview, maybe some sort of important framing questions to think about. Then we'll have Emma and Kenny introduce your own sort of perspective and research and how this relates to the topic today. I have some questions that I'm going to start the conversation off with, but if you are in the audience and you have a question that is burning, don't hold it in. Please just like type it up in the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and we'll definitely get to a lot of questions the second half of the discussion. All right, so thank you everyone for coming, and Jamie, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So to simplify, you got a good description of my research interests, but to simplify, what I really focus on is how do nonprofits get the resources they need to do what they do, and how does this acquisition impact their service delivery? When I first started, like my dissertation at Ohio State, by the way, because all of my graduate degrees come from Ohio State, I was looking at strictly financial portfolios and reading a lot of IRS 990 tax statements, like a lot. But that has really, really grown out. And so today I'm gonna do, because I'm assuming no prior knowledge here, I'm gonna do a little bit of a nonprofit 101 to kind of discuss and explain what the nonprofit sector is and what these organizations are. And then I'm going to tell you about 3 projects that I have done and or I'm currently doing, and use those projects to highlight 3 themes that I think touch on the challenges of collaborating with nonprofit organizations. Specifically, I know there's other interests about other non-academic organizations, but generally speaking, and I will say that a lot of my nonprofit 101 is focused on the US nonprofit sector, although I know we may have some international participants, but one of my research projects actually expands beyond that. And so I also want to highlight that many of the trends that we are seeing within the nonprofit sector and the pressures that are being put on the nonprofit sector are also similar to the pressures that we as researchers are facing. So when I'm talking about what's going on in the nonprofit sector, you might also feel some identification with, the challenges of resource acquisition and delivering on your own research agendas if that is your area. The things I want to focus on here when it comes to what's going on in the nonprofit sector look at service delivery, resource acquisition, and mission criminalization. We see, nonprofits, there are over 1.8 registered or recognized nonprofits in the United States, and that means basically that they have filed for nonprofit status with the IRS, the tax entity there's tax code that says here's how you qualify as a nonprofit. If you fill out the right paperwork and your mission is deemed as a nonprofit, you get this tax status. So we hear them referred to as 501c3 or C4 organizations. That's the most common designation. And that is literally referring to the tax code, right? The section of the tax code that describes nonprofits. So there are lots of other social movements and social organizations that do nonprofit work, that do work that is of public benefit, of community benefit. They may just not have the tax benefit. So we know we're undercounting the number of organizations, but this is sort of the best of what we have available. And this means that nonprofits make up the third largest sector of employment in the US, behind, I think it's manufacturing and retail. And also, I like to say nonprofits lost the branding war. Like they account for 6% of GDP in the United States. There's like $3 trillion that flow in and out of the sector. So to say nonprofit, people have something in their mind, but we're talking about a pretty significant chunk of funds and resource flows. So they're operating in every congressional district, for example, and account again for $3 trillion in revenue. So they're often complementing or substituting for government service. And they are in, like I said, every congressional district, 95% of counties across. So wherever you are in the United States, you have probably encountered nonprofits. And these are everything from, I don't know, food pantries to dog rescues to art museums to houses of worship. And so they're doing a lot on the ground, and that takes a lot of resources. There's a lot of pressure right now. Nonprofits are, I believe it's somewhere between 60 to 80% of all nonprofits receive some sort of government funding. In Ohio alone, there are $8 billion that come from government grants to nonprofit organizations. And I believe it's Franklin County has the highest number of nonprofits, something like 700 registered. Cuyahoga County and Hamilton also, those are the top three counties. But there have been immediate like shutoffs in the spigot in the money flows from government grants to money that had been allocated. So for those of you who have had government grants that were canceled or their status was shifted after having received notification of funding, similarly nonprofit organizations receive some of the same notifications and pressures. Money that had been allocated and expected and built into budgets was suddenly not there and sort of unexpectedly or without a lot of notice. So we've got a lot of demands for service. And if you think about the shifts in not just government funding, but government services itself, you've got services that aren't happening. So there's a lot more pressure being put on nonprofits, and with fewer resources and lack of notice of that notice. Then there's also the sort of I say legality of the mission, and this is both at the federal and the state level. There are certain nonprofit organizations, certain missions that are being targeted at state legislatures. In addition to Ohio, I spent 8 years teaching at Indiana University, Indianapolis. So I'm very familiar with the state house activities there too, that are very, very there's some shared interests and shared commonalities, the Ohio State House and the Indiana State House. And so certain organizations are not only facing resource shortages, but they're also facing legal challenges to the pursuit of their missions. And so these are, again, and if you're someone who researches things like equity or gender or certain things, you know that the research into these topics is being targeted, and so is also the actual work on the ground to address some of these questions and issues. And so this is sort of a background to the organizations that I study and the questions that I have worked on and am continuing to work on. I'm going to use three projects to highlight. So one of them is my first ever project when I was my first term in grad school. I think Ohio State was still on semesters at the time, so that tells you, or on quarters at the time, so that like tells you how long ago this was. But I was involved in a project with the Mid Ohio Food Bank. I think it's now known as the Food Collective. But their big question was, how do we can get food in? How do we get more food out to hungry people? Um, and so that was one question about capacity. I also one of my two big projects now is a cross-border philanthropy project examining money flows from USI NGOs to Israeli nonprofits. So literally, like, where is the money coming from and where is it going at an institutional level? And the other big project that I have is a justice philanthropy project that looks at community foundations that have made commitments to pursue racial equity. Um, for those who are unfamiliar, community foundations are place-based, geographically bound organizations that take funding from local philanthropists and local funders and distribute it out to meet the needs of their community. And there's lots of questions about this. The history, where they're often warehouses of often white privileged wealth, serving communities that the demographics of the recipients don't match the demographics of the donors. And so, what does that look like? And all these questions about power and access come into play. So there's some big themes out there and big questions and long ongoing questions. But to highlight some of my learnings and get to some of the ethics and the questions that have been asked of this panel, I want to highlight three things. One is the importance of lived experience. One is positionality, and the other one is power. Again, this word that keeps on giving. And I start with this. The Mid Ohio Food Bank project, capacity project, was an incredibly influential project for me as a researcher. I'm privileged. I've never had to go to a food bank as a client. I don't know what it takes to have to show need. I've never had to face the shame or the stigmas involved in that, and even the logistic challenge of that. And the food bank itself, they engaged with Ohio State with the Glenn School to say, how do we get more money out? They were looking primarily for a survey at the time. And I realized, I think before we can design a survey, we need to have some conversations with the people that do the work and the people that benefit from the work, in order to really determine what some of the barriers might be. I think if I were to ask you what are some of the barriers, you would think maybe they need more shelf space or more freezers or something like that. A lot of times we think of physical capacity, but what are some other reasons why, like, if we give them more freezers or we give them money to hire more people, will that get the food out? Or are there values-based barriers or roles-based or other capacities that we are not thinking about? And one of the things that really struck me that I would not have learned had I not had these conversations. We had focus groups before we designed the survey. We had focus groups and we designed them. We don't want to burden, this is one thing that comes up. We don't want to burden our participants, right? We wanted to make them able to participate in our focus groups, but not taking them too far out of their ways. So 20 county service area in central Ohio. So those of you who are local to Ohio can kind of picture this. And so we designed focus groups and the Mid Ohio Food Bank, they had food pantries, partner agencies 10 minutes down the road, and also 2 hours and 45 minutes away, closer to Pittsburgh, right? Like Steubenville. Steubenville is closer to Pittsburgh, but can't access the Pittsburgh resources because it crosses lines, state lines. There's all sorts of government and FDA regulations that come into play. So how do we do this? So we set up a bunch of focus groups around the service area that made it so that no one would have to travel more than an hour to attend, right? And we offered food, we offered some compensation for their participation. And one of the things that really came through to me is like, I can't see you, but raise your hand, if you've donated cans to a food pantry, right? Like that's a common, right? That's a common thing. And it's a great visual, especially if you're, say, working with kids or trying to show them like what donating is. Or, at our synagogues, we often have like food drives during Passover or during Yom Kippur. And so it's a very common visual. What if you don't have a can opener? And benefit from the food if you don't have a can opener. And so that never like crossed my mind in all of my years of donating food or thinking about this. That came up because someone with experience, lived experience, both as a recipient and now as a worker, shared that learning. Right. And so it really made us think, how do we get food out? And the other one that comes from that is there was a food pantry in an urban location, and the director talked about how they would walk out on food distribution day because a common thing is you go, um, you get 3 days of meals, right? So 9 meals for however many people in your family. Um, and you get it usually in a big box, or in some bags. He would walk out on distribution day and see cans like all on the road. And he realized that people ride their bikes or take the bus and they can't carry all the food necessarily. You're not loading it into a car trunk. And so, are there ways we could be creative about giving the same amount of food, but maybe people can come more than once a month? So one of those, again, lived experience and really thinking about the how people can benefit from us. With my cross-border project, the thing that comes through is positionality. Who am I? I'm a Jewish woman from Ohio, living in New Jersey, working in New York. I have experience in Jewish communal service. That was my pre-academic career, and inspired me to pursue all of my degrees at the end of the day. But I know the Jewish communal, I know the Jewish community and Jewish communal organizations very, very well. I don't know the landscape necessarily of Israel. I am fluent in Hebrew and I can read the forms and whatnot, but I really don't want to read tax forms in Hebrew. Like that's not my idea of a good time. And so I need to work with people who know that aspect of the landscape. So I collaborate with researchers at Tel Aviv University, because together I can understand their landscape and they can understand mine. Like for me, I grew up, like you said, I'm a native Clevelander. I grew up in a very strong Jewish community that I just assumed was the norm. Of course, there's a JCC and the 47 other Jewish organizations, and that's just how things are. I didn't realize that's not the norm necessarily in all these different places, but I had to sort of explain what our Jewish communal institutions are, because in Israel, you don't really have Jewish communal institutions. You just have nonprofits that just, it's like, it's not a thing the way that we think of it here in terms of the Jewish institutional life and the structures that then facilitate some of those cross-border flows. I should be clear, the money that flows from the US to Israel is not just coming from Jewish organizations, but they make up a large chunk. And so I have the understanding of the structures here. I don't have the understanding of the structures and mechanisms there, right? And the last thing I want to highlight is this idea of power. And that comes really into play in the Justice Philanthropy Project. Where are the sources coming from? Okay. So who controls the decision making? Who is empowered within the organization to raise these issues? How coupled or decoupled are symbolic statements from the resources that are being put into play to address questions such as racism? Because to be perfectly honest, asking questions, asking a community foundation to examine its own contribution to sort of racism, systemic racism, and systematized, institutionalized practices is a big ask. It's how the work will get done. It's easy to, we've seen, put up the black squares on social media or to make statements. It's also easy to walk back statements, as we have seen, if the institutions and mechanisms are not to engage in real organizational change are not actually invested in, right? And so when I do this work, I try to keep all of these things in mind, lifting up lived experience, lifting up like, who am I to be in this research project? Like, what do I have to contribute, but what do I need to learn? And also, what sort of elements of power, either as a researcher or as a representative of institution, are coming into play. And so throughout all of these different projects, a few ways that I try to be mindful of all of these things is to make sure the relationship is two-way, that it's not extractive. It's not just me or my team coming in and asking questions, demanding time, all of that, but it's what can we give back? Is it, so that can take, the appearance of reports, but we've done convenings. We've done, for example, with our Justice Philanthropy, the organizations that we work with, we've done convenings of personnel when they as a network have convened as among their own organizations. They've sometimes brought us in as speakers or to facilitate workshops. We do member checks. So when we, for example, in the Justice Philanthropy Project, we do a lot of interviewing and then we'll write up reports and we will check back with the key participants and say, here was our understanding, here's our interpretation. Does this sort of match your words? We don't necessarily change content. Like they don't have editorial control necessarily, but we want to make sure that what we're hearing is and conveying back is an accurate reflection of what was said. And so we've done this, for example, before submitting journal articles and things like that. And also even highlighting participants as key personnel, like making sure, for example, that in the food bank project that we had people who use the pantry as clients as part of our focus groups, that we weren't just talking to key personnel or even, decision makers and in the C-suite, but also frontline bureaucrats, but also the people that actually have to take the food, right? And get that. And so I think that there are ways, these are all really important aspects to keep in mind when you're working with organizations, like they're people too, and they are subject to their own pressures. That kind of brings me back. I can wrap by bringing us back to the main themes of service provision, the stresses on resource acquisition, and even the criminalization of mission. We and again, because of the nature of what I'm studying, I'm subject to some of these pressures as a researcher. We want to make sure we're protecting our participants and ourselves. We as a team. So in my Justice Philanthropy Project, for example, we have researchers across 6 universities across 2 countries right now, and one of the countries not being in North America. And we have had conversations about, do we need to move our data off of especially state universities, Ohio State and Indiana University? Do we need to move data off of public FOIA-able servers? We don't email anymore. We chat. We use Signal, honestly, and we. Our Zooms, when we meet to even talk about the projects that we're doing, are hosted by our European colleague because Zoom Europe has better data protections. And so these are some of the ways that we have to think about protecting ourselves and also protecting our participants as well. We also have to be nimble with our projects because they change. Organizations, our partners, will sometimes bow out or close doors that were previously open, or just stop participating because of demands on their time and or concerns about being public, even if we do our best to protect their identity. That was a lot. So I hope also, as of this talk, this is like my disclaimer for everything now, that everything is subject to change. Because again, like a year ago when we were talking about how to, what should we stop emailing and do we need to shift our Zoom conversations? Like that was not something that had been on the agenda until last year, right? So everything is subject to change, but this is the state of our research and trying to balance the importance of these. By the way, I will end by saying, as challenging as these questions are, I think they are so super important and timely, and they're always relevant, I think. But the very challenges that these organizations are facing make highlighting these challenges that much more important, but also that much more challenging because of, fears and concerns and sheer time pressures and all of that. So I hope that laid the groundwork for further conversation and was what you were looking for. My email is up there. And I'm sure we can put it in a chat or in the Q&A box. And I will now turn it over to our other speakers, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Emma, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Jamie. That was great. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the perspective that I'm coming at these questions from. I'm a political theorist, and I've been working for a while now on ethical and political questions around philanthropy in particular. As Dana mentioned, my first book was called Private Virtues, Public Vices. And in that book, I develop a democratic political theory of philanthropy. That is, I ask how we should practice and regulate and evaluate philanthropy in light of specifically democratic values, which I understand to be concerned with treating people as social and political equals. So I started researching these questions in a different kind of political moment, but the perspective has never been government good, philanthropy bad. Rather, in the book, I develop 2 main lines of argument about how philanthropy can sometimes contribute to objectionably unequal social and political relationships, even when it's motivated by altruism or good intentions, and even when it really might produce some genuinely good outcomes or contribute important benefits to some people. So first, I think philanthropy can be a vehicle of plutocratic power. Some philanthropy can undermine relationships of democratic accountability and give rich people too much control over matters of common concern to some group of people. Philanthropy today is often really ambitious about trying to shape public outcomes, but it's not always doing that in a way that's transparent or accountable to the people it's trying to affect. Philanthropy can be a way of directing or limiting or influencing the activities of institutions, both formally public institutions and institutions like research centers, for instance, without the need to seek support and legitimacy from the broader public. And so that's a problem that I worry about, especially when philanthropy and support of nonprofits and research is deployed in coordination with policy advocacy. I think there's this sort of portfolio of ways that rich people can exert public influence in ways that aren't always readily apparent to the public. In the book, I also argue that some philanthropy can be paternalistic. That is, it can exercise power over people in ways that express disrespect for their ability to choose or act well on their own behalf. And in that sense, I think it can sometimes be demeaning or disrespectful or subordinating to the people who the philanthropist is trying to benefit, and sometimes to other affected parties. So I can say more about either of those issues in the Q&A or about the other work on dirty money that Dana mentioned. The thing I want to stress actually here is that I'm approaching these issues not as a specialist on research ethics, but as someone who's thought about academic research as one kind of site for philanthropic influence in democratic societies. And one theme of my work in general that I think might be important here is that there can be disconnects between individual ethics and public or political consequences, hence my title, Private Virtues, Public Vices. I think we can't always assess the political significance of some kinds of transactions or relationships by looking at them in isolation. Rather, we also need to think about broader patterns of influence. So to give you one example, the former WHO malaria chief has referred to the Gates Foundation's funding of malaria research as a cartel, right? I don't think that's the kind of worry that you can assess just from the perspective of an individual researcher deciding whether to apply for or accept Gates funding. That researcher may be acting with complete sincerity and integrity in pursuing funding for research they believe in. But nevertheless, the cumulative effects of one organization being so dominant in funding for research on a disease and the potential silencing of alternative perspectives on that could still be significant. So the point I guess I just want to raise for us to think about is that I don't think all systemic or democratic concerns about philanthropy need to be traceable to a failure of individual integrity or problem solving. And so sometimes ethical concepts we have, like conflict of interest, might not fully capture the issues at stake. Rather, we need to think about broader patterns of power is the word that Jamie's raised for us, and I think it's the one to focus on here. Academics and nonprofits today face a common problem. They're all, I think, pursuing missions they believe in the context of increasingly scarce funding and competition for resources. And the questions they face aren't just about how to do the most good they can with scarce resources, but how much control or influence to allow their donors. One reason for being interested in academic nonprofit partnerships is not just thinking about how these organizations might influence each other's work, but how they might become conduits for donor influence over each other and also over public policy. And so maybe the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Kenny is that I think one important role for research ethics is to help resolve collective action problems. A lot of the time, these questions are of interest because we may not really know what the right thing to do is, and that's why these care panels are such a wonderful resource that Dana has provided us with. But sometimes we might already have a pretty good sense of what we think the right thing to do is, but feel unable to pursue that for fear of being outcompeted for resources or sacrificing the interests of our own organization. And so I think one important benefit to trying to develop shared standards of research ethics is to create an ethical culture that could make it easier for individuals to do what they might already recognize as the right thing. For instance, by developing norms and expectations against some kinds of donor conditionality or control.
Thank you so much, Emma. Kenny, your turn.
Terrific. Thank you. No, and I really appreciate you organizing this, Dana, and I'm excited because these are issues. The content of my research is not so relevant. It's rather the process I've used over the years, and these are issues I've thought a lot about, but I've lacked the kind of framework that Jamie and Emma bring to this. So I'm really excited that you've gotten us together, and I hope to come out with complete, verifiable answers by the end of by lunchtime. So thank you. Now, I work as a research scientist, mostly on topics related to preventing different types of family violence. Some current examples include evaluating a large statewide child abuse prevention program and helping state governments improve how their adult protective services system, how they respond to intervene with vulnerable older adults who experience abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And in some ways, this work is traditionally academic. My colleagues and I, we publish in peer-reviewed journals using hypotheses, and then you test hypotheses and then write up the results. Yet in other ways, our work is driven by factors beyond the search for truth with a capital T, like the shifting needs of agencies and organizations that hire us. And so a new federal regulation or a directive from the governor's office might all of a sudden midstream change what we're doing. And all of a sudden, it doesn't matter the methodological rigor and the implications of that. We've got to change it. And so we do. And also, a lot of the funders that hire us want already do so knowing the results they want us to produce. They want us to show that their program works. Whereas, like I said, we can test if it works, but there's a tension there. That said, the pressures that we face in doing this type of applied research can be frustrating, but they also make our work immediately relevant. And I've been inspired and very happy to be kind of working in this space where being able to see within real time, like how the work we do actually translates into substantive policy changes. So I'm happy to be part of that. So, but between this sort of academic and non-academic sort of approaches, I feel a real ethical tension. How do I balance my integrity as a researcher or perhaps my commitment to truth with the value of being relevant or perhaps even, and maybe get into conflict of interest issues that Emma raised. There's a benefit for me to maintain my good relationships with the agencies I'm studying. And so to the extent I can show them, give them what they want, they'll be much more likely to hire me down the road and continue to do that. So I want to acknowledge that my own, I have a dog in this fight too. Complicating this fact is that most of the projects that I'm working on are not designed to produce definitive conclusions. I mean, it'd be great to run a randomized clinical trial, but they tend to be prohibitively expensive, lengthy, and they require a degree of investigator control that's really not practical in the real world. So to what extent, given this kind of the less than ideal methodological rigor that I bring to these projects, should that give me any greater wiggle room to interpret results sympathetically? Lastly, and then of course, this whole debate I have kind of parallels longstanding debates about the appropriate role of scholarship in society, whether research should be sort of an unapologetic search for truth, implications be damned, or whether all research is inherently value laden and can reinforce structural inequalities, Q marks, Gramsci, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then there's I think as I alluded to before, and so as I've said, I'm unsure how my work really fits into these frameworks of, you can say, sort of a positivist versus maybe a critical framework. Would the people I'm studying, their subject, that's different than the systems I'm studying. I'm working with the systems. And so to what extent should my allegiance be to these maltreated children, to these older vulnerable adults? Are they better served by me taking a positivist approach and just trying to do the best possible research, even if the results result in defunding the prevention programs that they're currently benefiting from? Or are they better served by me kind of framing research findings sympathetically and doing what I can to buttress the systems that currently are available, however imperfectly, to serve them. So, and then, as I mentioned before, my own conflict of interest. Part of the success of my career has been my ability to appear, hopefully but maybe appear rigorous, but also be responsive in working with folks. And I was happy to go through the participant list and see that I had sent this out uncharacteristically, perhaps, to a bunch of my collaborators around the country and other places. And I'm happy to see some fellow researchers who I admire for their ability to collaborate with agencies, but also some of the folks from state agencies around the country who have signed on and are here. So thank you. Shout out to Texas, et cetera. So let's see. So I think carefully about how part of the success of my career is the ability to appear rigorous, yet be a responsive collaborator. And I think carefully about how to acknowledge the limitations of our research, yet still have the sort of top line be something that the funder can use. And so that's where I'm at. I'm happy to kind of open up the conversations and just learn from and with Jamie and Ellen. And
thank you so much, Kenny, Emma, and Jamie. So many just like really interesting questions related to like theoretical questions, but also like really like small, like very timely tidbits that we should really be thinking about at this moment. And I appreciate you bringing up so much already for conversation. And thanks, Kenny, for highlighting the fact that we have audience members that are not only academics and researchers, but also potentially working in agencies. So please, audience members, if you have any questions or comments, please put in the Q&A questions, and we're definitely going to get to a lot of those as well. So get those started up. I have some questions to just get the conversation rolling. And so, I mean, maybe thinking through the opportunities that come with these sorts of partnerships. So let's start with this idea of the value of collaborative relationships between academic researchers and non-academic partners. Kenny, you said that, you know, it's incredibly like rewarding and inspiring. And, you know, I mean, why are these sorts of collaborations important? And so one question is like, how are these collaborations important in sort of the outcomes of those in terms of policy and sort of public impact? But another question that I'm kind of interested from you, if you've engaged in this sort of research, has your own scholarship improved through these sorts of collaborations? Is there something you can do in partnership that you wouldn't have been able to do outside of it? So maybe, Kenny, we could start with you, and then Jamie and Emma, if you have also something to share, we could move on from there.
Sure. No, I guess, I mean, people probably are familiar with the term like evidence-based practice or evidence-based programs. And that's something certainly as independent researchers or objective researchers can certainly help bring and to fields and help, and to society in general, help folks benefit. I also, however, to apropos your question, really have benefited a lot in my own research from what you might call practice-based research or practice-driven research, where I hear from them, this is what we really need to know. And in which case, like an academic question is really kind of pejorative. So for instance, one example I can give is I've kind of mused with folks about like the adult protective services system. Some folks are on the call from that. And there has been, I think it's fair to say, some criticism of the system. And is it really effective, et cetera? And so we've been trying to think about how would we evaluate this more systematically. And one of the challenges is that they address many different types of problems. And the most common that they face is that they address types of investigations that they have is something called self-neglect. You might be familiar with this with a person who's not necessarily being maltreated by someone else, but rather is not really taking care of themselves in a way that sufficiently. And this raises ethical issues about at what point does the state have the legitimacy to come in and tell someone you're hoarding, you're not living in a manner that society has deemed acceptable, and so we're going to intervene. As you can imagine, this gets very difficult to intervene successfully. It's a big challenge, yet it's the single most common thing that APS programs typically do. And so maybe one thing would be to say maybe a different system should handle self-neglect, and APS should focus on other, it maybe is better organized to handle other types of mistreatment. And so a colleague who's, from the practice world, I was kind of musing this, so this sounds good. We can look at some ways of looking. And she said, well, you don't understand, like a lot of these types, a lot of the people who are self-neglecting are also experiencing maltreatment perpetrated by others. So to sort of, it's very nice, Mr. Researcher, for you to come in and propose a nice approach to kind of distinguish the two, but in reality, it's not going to fly. And so, I think of that as an example that's sort of where someone from the practice community patiently sort of explained to me why I was not that we have totally lost that train of thought, but rather we need to qualify it and to think more carefully. But so I think it keeps us honest, keeps me honest at least, and grounded. And I think and I think it's an important part of what these types of collaborations bring.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Kenny says. And, for me, like academic publications are great. They're important. They're like what our cases are judged on and whatnot. But they don't matter as much to me if the research isn't actually making a difference for the organizations that I'm serving. Like, what does it matter if I'm answering questions about resource acquisition if it doesn't reach the audience? And so having partners, being able to work with partners means that like the research is they're helping shape the questions, and then they're also like benefiting from and shaping the answers. The can opener anecdote is like one of my favorites because it was so formative. It was like I said, my very first quarter at Ohio State as a PhD student. So I didn't even really know like what is research, like how do I even ask big questions? But it really, what it did for me and what has continued as a practice is I have learned, well, that project really taught me, are we asking the right questions? Right? Like, are these the right questions in the first place? And then my work since then, especially around justice philanthropy, always makes me ask, even if this is the right question, am I the person to be asking it? And so what does my research team need to look like? Who are the collaborators? What are we missing? What viewpoints do we not have? Who's not at the table shaping from the research perspective, in addition to with our partners? And I wouldn't even think to take that sort of metacognition, like reflection, without really being thrown in the deep end and really realizing in the first place, like, let's start by talking to the people who are the most impacted by this and really making me realize like what I may know a lot about certain things, but there's a lot I don't know about a lot of other things. So how can we make that happen? So yeah, it's really like, am I asking the right question? And am I the person to be asking these questions have really kind of shaped the trajectory and my approach to research since.
Thank you, Jamie. Emma, do you want to add anything to this question or no?
Not a ton, and maybe
Yeah.
it's too obvious to even say, but I think the interesting thing coming out of both Kenny and Jamie's comments is that it seems important to recognize that money isn't always the most important or even particularly significant thing that partners are getting from each other. So in each particular case, I think it can be worth asking, what are the partners getting from each other or from this collaboration? I don't mean that in an insidious way, but is it funding? Is it data in the sense of sort of tools to research with? Is it information or learning in a broader sense? Is it legitimacy or a connection to actual policy impact? And in what ways are those hopes of benefit going to shape the agenda for good or bad?
Thanks, Emma. And I'm going to ask you the next question to start us off because it is related to funding and money. And, I mean, this is a precarious funding situation for many researchers currently. And, I thank Jamie for highlighting the fact that the experiences that researchers are facing are also being experienced in the nonprofit world at the same time. And so as funding support from the federal government is being reduced, or priorities are just shifting, right? So it's not necessarily reductions in funding. Researchers and nonprofits may be more reliant on private donors, right? And more like individual donors or organizations. how does this change, if at all, the research landscape? And as a follow-up, I mean, how should researchers navigate this new landscape? Yeah, I'll start. Emma, you answer that question. And something that Jamie said late in your presentation, I want to ask a follow-up, but let's start with that question, right?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess I don't want to take for granted that the landscape is totally new or transformed. Maybe for me, I see this as a difference of degree or a move in a direction we were already going in, for a few reasons we can point to. So, first of all, academic research is not by any means the largest recipient of philanthropic dollars. That's still organized religion, which gets about a third of charitable donations in the US. But there's a difference in the kind of donors we're talking about. So religious organizations get a lot of their money from a high volume of small dollar amount contributions. Donations to research are more often from single elite large donors or institutional sources of funding. And those are the kinds of donors who are going to be in a better position to have an agenda that they want to advance and exercise leverage over recipient organizations. So that's one thing that when you're talking about more powerful donors, it changes the potential effects of that donation. I think it's also hard to think about the impact of donations just by looking at dollar amounts, which can sometimes seem pretty small. If you look at sort of public education in the US, the amount that even a philanthropic giant like the Gates Foundation has contributed is totally dwarfed by public spending. But I think that the influence donors can exercise isn't just a function of dollar amounts, but the fact that that's the money at the margin, right? That the public amount is sort of there or not there, and institutions are used to working around those constraints or adapting when it shrinks. But at any given moment, the thing that they can adjust their behavior to try to get is often going to be philanthropic funding today. And again, that I think increases the kind of leverage that donors are able to exercise. And then finally, and this isn't a change of the last few years, but more like the last 20 to 30, donors have become increasingly confident and interested in advancing particular organizational missions or policy priorities by exerting, I won't say micromanage, but exerting more careful kinds of oversight and control over the activities of recipient organizations. So the kind of one-off general support grant that the Rockefeller generation used to make has been sort of superseded by much more complicated reporting requirements, sort of progress reports to the donor in many cases, not all. And so I think that more managerial approach to relationships between donors and grantees can increase the costs of some kinds of collaboration when there's reporting requirements, benchmarks to meet that divert not maybe just the mission or agenda of research, but where researcher time is going when so much of it is spent on grants and demonstrating progress to the funders. And so I guess those are a few of the issues that come to mind for me in this area.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, so that's really nicely highlighting the way in which this landscape is potentially changing. And I wonder, Kenny, do you want to share like how you're navigating this, or whether you think that this puts added pressures on researchers?
Oh, pressures, what pressure? I guess a couple things, and I generally agree with Emma, what she said. I think the main change, at least for me, and I speaking from my experience, and I think this is representative of a lot of colleagues I've talked to, even in other fields, is just the increasing uncertainty. And that there's a lot of people, there's just the process has gotten mucked up. A lot of agencies, people have left, the staffers have left. And so they lack the capacity to just move grants through efficiently as they had before. And those who remain, a lot of the people in the mid and higher upper level positions are political appointees who might lack some experience with the topic or the systems involved. And so everyone's kind of keeping their head down, not wanting to offend the powers that be higher up. And so not much gets done. So there's sort of been a real mucking up of the system, which has slowed down, which for folks like me, where I'm entirely 100% soft money, funded through my own grant, and that gets harder to sustain if things are all of a sudden taking 2 years to get through the system rather than just, let's say, 6 months. So that's been the change. But in terms of like the shifting priorities, that's always kind of been the case in terms of like there's always going to be some topics that are hot. I think what's perhaps a little novel these days is that there's some topics that are definitely off limits. We talk about Jamie alluded to earlier about DEI and some of these social justice buzzwords, and yeah, then that's certainly true. And I can give examples from my own work. I don't have to now about how that's been kind of put the kibosh on certain advances. But one issue I'd like to raise, and in terms of foundations, and excuse my naivete, but when Emma's talking about sort of private donors, and I'm conflating that kind of with foundations, maybe fairly, maybe not fairly. I'm not sure how that works. And in my experience, foundations can be really helpful for sort of riskier projects where you're sort of trying out something novel and new and that might catch their interest and attention. And so I think that could be good. What I'm curious about, and this is a question as much as a comment, is that I've long been one of the things that attracts me to elder abuse in particular is that it's not particularly sexy. A lot of people aren't interested in talking about it, and there's probably, and unlike a lot of social programs where we have approaches to addressing it, it's probably not cost effective to address it. There's just, I can get into the reasons why the calculus just isn't there. The most cost-effective thing to do for older, vulnerable adults is nothing. Let them die quicker, at less cost to society. That's horrific. That we shouldn't be doing that. And people often bristle when you mention that, but then that highlights the limits of cost effectiveness as a value in our policy making. So one role that I could see foundations playing, and religious institutions actually, I think, do a pretty good job of this, is actually stepping into the gap and saying there's dignity in every human being. We want to protect people, even if it doesn't make economic sense. And so therefore, we want to think about how to do that as effectively and efficiently as possible. And so I'm kind of a question to say, I don't know if there are other examples of other issues or foundations where they have kind of proactively, even despite the vices that might result, whether there's some precedent for sort of these foundations stepping into that, into this area that doesn't really make economic sense at a time when a lot of policymakers expect a return on investment for their use of taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, so I think the short answer is it depends, not just on the sector that we're talking about, but the kind of donors and the kinds of relationships the donors have with the public sector. So I think you just made the sort of best case for foundation involvement in some areas as a counterweight to government orthodoxy, funding alternative priorities. One thing that I worry about is cases where philanthropy and government are actually working together. And so rather than that counterweight, there's the construction of a shared orthodoxy. And in public K through 12 education in the US, I think that was a big problem. So the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and the Gates Foundation working very closely to pursue a similar agenda. And so rather than playing that kind of alternative role, it was maybe mutually reinforcing. But I agree in principle.
And Jamie, I want you to also chime in on this question about whether you think that, the funding changes lend themselves to new responsibilities on the part of researchers. But one thing you also mentioned that I think that Kenny just brought up also is this sort of the mission politicization or the mission criminalization, and thinking about both protecting organizations and also the participants, research participants. So how should researchers navigate the new political, we may not have the answers here, but how should we think about these problems where certain words or certain research questions are no longer even allowed to be funded through the government?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think some of it is recognizing our own power. If if you're someone who has tenure, for example, and access to research streams, can you, and this is like your area, can you bring on junior scholars or expand your teams or, kind of and speak up and advocate and also like understand, for example, some of the impacts of this is that research is slowing, both because projects have to be stopped or new, it takes, when you have to stop, when you have to focus on new grant applications, well, that's time that you're not actually doing the research. And then, I don't know how it is for you in political science, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's similar. Like our journal like review times are atrocious because people aren't doing as much of the free labor because they're burnt out for like myriad valid reasons that so like what is and like speaking for myself as someone who does cross-border philanthropy between the US and Israel and like racial justice philanthropy, those are some really fraught topics right now. It's not easy to publish on things like race, even on a good day, whatever a good day was. And so, as researchers, like how are we protecting our own and taking those into account and not just looking at like journal citation counts for tenure where tenure protection still exists. So some of this are the meta like professional, the impact on the meta professional questions because these are actually I think some of the questions of our time, and yet they're really hard to answer. And then if you can answer them, they're really hard to get published. And like, what does that mean? That doesn't stack up to. And so, as researchers, we have that responsibility, I think, to protect our own. Some of it is, it's always a balance of personal and professional values too. And when your values align and sticking up for your values and things that are important come with risks. Um, and so, are you willing to take it? And it's understandable if you say no. And then, but I do think if you are able to successfully pursue new research streams or work with funders that hadn't previously been in this space, what protections are you building in so that you retain control over the information, the distribution of findings, the editorial control, all of that? So I think it's like across the board from the actual accessing new funds or existing funds and building in protections to the meta, like what does this look like in the field and what does this mean and how can we use our outdated P&T standards and actually like update them. All of that's a whole gamut to think about when it comes to some of these things.
Thank you, Jamie. There's actually one of the audience members, Mabel Bustamante, has asked, I think, a really nice follow-up question related to some of these issues, and something that Kenny mentioned about like efficiency as like the metric and how that's not necessarily going to be a useful metric for all research questions, right? So Mabel asks, in what way does the professionalization of aid and research where, for example, academics need publications and agencies need success stories to get more funding, prevent them from truly handing over the reins? How do we create collaborations and project metrics that reward institutions, basically, it's like, how should we think about sort of the metrics for research that are like in light of this sort of professionalization and the need for success stories in order to get more funding and to continue the mission of the agencies. So maybe we'll start with Kenny and then Emma or Jamie if you want to respond.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking of this question in two different ways. One is, from putting on like a dean's hat, or some, POA, like what's the, what should be the criteria for tenure or for what have you in terms of, and that, yeah, and actually I was involved in this as a faculty member in the College of Public Health years ago. And yeah, it's hard. People say it's really nice and yes, teaching, research, service, all important. And yet, one of the questions is, are there different ways of sort of contributing in a meaningful way to recognizing that some people are going to be really strong in service and other people are going to be really strong in research and others are going to be strong in teaching, and what's a reasonable sort of minimal expectation of each of these, and how does one balance that out? So I am not interested in those questions. I'll kind of defer that to others who might have a better sense. That's why I am where I am, happily so. But in terms of the other question, in terms of maybe getting research funding, how should funders look at this? Should we look at someone who, let's say, has a lot of relevant publications, but not in a top tier journal? Is that something, and why isn't it in a top tier journal? Well, maybe because it wasn't as methodologically rigorous. Well, why not? Because it required more collaboration in order to do that, and therefore the investigator had to give up some more control. And that meant that it couldn't be as methodologically rigorous as it might otherwise be. And so, perhaps understandably, so I'm not saying that the top tier journals should all be publishing, wildly varying quality of research, but that I think there's maybe I would be interested in creating, talking about how to create space for these more exploratory approaches to doing research that do merit sort of attention. The other thing I mentioned before, elder abuse is not particularly sexy. And so a lot of my experience in journals is that there's like a journal of elder abuse and neglect. There's a journal of adult protection. There's a journal of gerontological social work, well, nice, but none of these are top tier. And in order to kind of get, if you're going to go to NIA, like National Institute of Aging or some other, you can publish in those, but that's probably not sufficient in and of itself to be merit sort of, you need to be getting better, but publications better. And how does that work? And how does one, and so that's what I'm sort of, as I have some ideas about probably beyond this, but another way I might want to be interested in framing the question, but I'll stop there and then kind of pass the baton.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking at this question, and I think that one thing to think about is the impact of the research itself on the partner organizations, right? Like, it can be a way to think about, as opposed to thinking of one as the primary stakeholder or the winner or whatever. What is created sort of from the synergy from the partnership? Like, did the research, for example, lead to a change in organizational behavior or impact? Like, from our justice philanthropy project has many arms and many elements to it, but one of the things that we've done is study a network, an aligned action network of 7 organizations that had made commitments to pursuing racial equity in their practices, and one of our, like, as a result of our phase 1 work with them, we were able to highlight the disconnect between the messages they were sending to external stakeholders about the work they were doing and the sort of lack of institutional practices to back it up, right? And so as a result, and the network actually like cites our research as the motivation for this, they actually created a tool to assess internal capacity for doing this work. And that's like a win that I can point to straight from, that isn't an academic partnership, but that is, and in fact, like, might not be valued in certain academic circles because it's, just service or community engagement. Clearly not the value I hold, but, and so that was a mutual win because we asked a question and sort of found some really interesting answers, and then they took that and did something with it. So thinking about what do wins look like when this, and by the way, this research was funded by a major foundation. So being able to say, like, look, because of your funding, we did this work, and then we found this thing, and then they acted on that and made these changes, was a very cool chain of events. And so thinking broadly about that and where those get valued and how this can be counted as wins, I think can help with some of these challenges as well.
So one question that has come up that I would love to explore a little bit more is this, is the conflict potential, or at least a tension between one's like professional integrity and research interests and one's advocacy and what you care about and what got you in the first place. And I mean, sometimes the most interesting questions are not, like, academically, are not the like most important questions, or are not the most important things that we have to do, right? And so I mean, I guess one question is just sort of how should researchers who have like a research agenda, right? How should researchers navigate potential disagreements about priorities of research when they're partnering with organizations? Yeah. Like this one. This one is hard for me. So yeah, Kenny, do you have any thoughts?
I have thoughts. Yeah, no. I guess it does spurn from me this one thing I've tried to do in my own work, and it is also and think through and anticipate and listen to what they want, regardless of what the funding is for the current project. And so, for instance, again, specific to elder abuse and adult protective services, right now, for a variety of reasons I won't get into, funding is very fraught. And there's a lot of concerns about state, especially state level support for these kind of systems moving forward. And one of the things that is part of some national initiative I'm helping work on is trying to think, okay, well, what can we as researchers help do to, as advocates, to help them better advocate for the importance of adult protective services, or at the very least, the importance of elder abuse as a research, building awareness among policymakers and the public, et cetera. And so one of the things we've done is taking just in a credible way, trying to create county level estimates of the number of older adults in each county in the United States, who a conservative estimate, how many in your county experience abuse, neglect, exploitation each year, sort of a past year prevalence estimate. And also, so keeping it local, but also putting it in context. How does that compare to the number of older adults in your county who are newly diagnosed with cancer each year, who are involved in a motor vehicle crash each year, who have Alzheimer's, who've had Alzheimer's in the past year? And if you actually put those together, you can actually say, wow, elder mistreatment is every bit as common as these other more widely recognized concerns for older adults. Not that it's more important, not that, prevalence is the only criterion we should use for figuring out how to prioritize scarce resources, but it's one that kind of resonates very quickly with. And so we're doing this now, and we're in the process of doing this, and a bunch of researchers and practitioners from around the country, and some of whom are actually on the call. And so that's one example of, as a volunteer effort, we're kind of taking our time as sort of a good faith effort to do that. So yeah, so that down the road, and maybe there's an unwritten sort of expectation, transaction where like, hey, Kenny's a good guy. Like, oh yeah, I'll listen to him if he has a good idea for a proposal. And so but that's part of the price of working collaboratively, is say I have to take extra time, when time is money, to actually invest in those types of relationships, doing what they tell me they need done, and leveraging my own integrity as a researcher in order to serve them. And so that they then provide me with the access to data so that I can then do the publish in in the way and get the grants that I need. So there's some element to transaction in it, but both of it, I think, in both ways, is a matter of listening and being sensitive to what people really need, and being honest about like, this is what I need to do, and I can do this, but I can't do that. So that's sorry if I unmuted too quickly, but I was excited.
No, that's great. Yeah. Emma or Jamie, do you have any thoughts on how to navigate the sort of potential tensions between research and the needs of the partnering agencies?
I don't know about how to navigate it. I guess I would just stress the ways that the kinds of ethical challenges might look different than the paradigm conflict of interest cases, which, maybe it's helpful to compare cases where you're partnering with industry sponsors, like an e-cigarette company wants me to show that e-cigarettes are healthier than smoking cigarettes. Or maybe less cartoonishly, Coca-Cola wants me to show that exercise is the most important thing for reducing obesity, not stop drinking pop or things. In those cases, I take it that the conflict of interest is both that there's an element of personal gain for me, the funding or the career advancement that I get from it, and that there's an interest there that's opposed to the public interest, and industry sort of personal benefit that it's seeking potentially at the expense of the public. And I think in these nonprofit partnership cases, it's probably not in the normal run of things going to look like that. The personal gain for the researcher is probably going to be less obvious. Often there are more lucrative or sexier things you could be researching. They're researching something because they think it's important and they care about it. And the organization they're partnering with is probably also not motivated by personal gain. There may be an element of sort of defending their own territory, but it's not sort of pursuing a sectional interest at the expense of the public in the same way. So I think that the conflict is less about sort of self-interest as opposed to the public good, and more conflicts about how the public good is defined, and ways that attempts to find common ground between the researcher and the nonprofit partner could result in a distortion of the research agenda in a way that's less obviously driven by anyone's malign self-interest. And that would be more about, I mean, I take it at the end of the day, the major difference between a nonprofit and an academic researcher is that the nonprofit has a permission, maybe a duty to pursue the good of a particular population that it's trying to serve. And a researcher has a duty to report on what they think the truth is, even where those two things come into conflict. I think a lot of the time, hopefully, they'll be aligned, and that's why these partnerships can benefit everybody. But if there's a conflict, it's in that space.
I think there are a couple of considerations and agreed with a lot of what Emma and Kenny have said. Some of it is at the outset, you know, setting yourself up to work with organizations you think might be able to provide some of the answers in the way you hope that they'll be able to provide them, and maintaining the control over the findings and the dissemination. I think from a broader perspective, having faith, confidence, whatever your word of choice is, that if you're a good researcher, you're following what the research is telling you and the methods that it's telling you to use. Like I said, I started my question of like, how do nonprofits get the resources they need by strictly a financial view, reading IRS statements. And I still read a lot of IRS statements, and that's a whole other life choice. But I I think that I've also again been led down this path of a lot of qualitative, participant focused research that is very rigorous. It's not, and it's empirical. It's not, a quantitative data set. I could retreat and stick with my big IRS data sets and answer different questions, but some of it is like, what is your own risk tolerance? Even with academic freedom in some places and less so in others. How much, even if you are convinced that you are asking the right questions and using the right methods, like other people might not buy into it or might not want what you're selling or any of that. And so there is risk involved in pursuing some of these things. Again, whether it's just like longer timelines to publications, less quality publications, if that's the thing that you're working in, and you have to try to be in a place that will support that or find ways to support that. And it does come with risks, and not every place is gonna believe in that. And so know that, and like if you're early stage, for example, on a tenure track, it's reasonable to back off potentially, especially in these environments. And so some of that is like, what are your own personal values? How can you protect yourself and the sort of sanctity of the research and the research findings, but also knowing like you are probably taking on an element of risk if you're pursuing what you believe in the way that it needs to be pursued, and have faith in that. And that's not an easy ask, right?
Yeah. So Jamie, let me like one more. We have 2 more minutes left, and so I just based on what you just said, I would love to hear from you if you think that research is a kind of advocacy in itself. Like, is it? Or is it
I don't think it is. I think it can be used that way, and it can be defined by others in that way. I think especially if people have like certain research agendas and want to hear or not hear certain things. Emma, you said that it's sort of like a pursuit of truth. And like if we have faith that we are like my whole grad education was at Ohio State. Thank you, Fisher College of Business. Thank you, Glenn School. But I like if you have faith that your public money, for example, is being your money is being invested to train the best of the best, and that this is how they're answering the question, like have faith in that regardless of what the research is. And also if it's going to be embraced or painted as advocacy, like lean into that, I think too, right? And so like if you think it's showing a truth and you believe in the truth that it's showing, like use that. I used my nonprofit training from Fisher and from the Glenn School when I was in Indiana to co-found a healthcare advocacy organization. And I said, look, like I'm not a healthcare professional, but I know nonprofits and I know the advocacy space. So I can help with like the IRS related stuff and the organizational formalization stuff. Like if I'm already going to be painted as a specific researcher researching equity in Indiana, right? Like, all right, lean in and use it. Like if other people are going to paint it as advocacy, they are or they aren't going to do that. They are or aren't going to frame what you put out there as a certain thing. So like you can't really control that narrative. You can only control the work that you're doing and the belief behind it and how you want the findings to be used. What other people say about it is almost irrelevant in some ways. If they're going to call it advocacy, all right, let them. I don't know that that matters as much as like what it is you're doing. If you're if you're asking the right questions and you think you're the person to answer them and you think you have the right methods to answer them.
So what I'm hearing is it's advocacy for truth and can be used for advocacy for also good ends that you care about. Maybe Emma or Kenny, do you have a view about this question about is research in itself a kind of advocacy?
I think so, yes, in two brief ways, and I'll be quick. One is that in the attention economy that we have, where everyone's so, trying to grab attention to different issues. Yeah, if you study a certain issue, by definition, you're going to be hopefully drawing attention to that. So in that sense, it's sort of just the nature of your work on whatever topic you're focusing on is a type of advocacy. The other piece of it, just own experience, is that, and this might be a gendered issue in terms of being a man or appearing as a man, is that I often position myself if I'm testifying on a committee or something like that, or to legislators, whatever, as sort of like dispassionate researcher. And so I'm not an advocate. The advocate's next door. I can come in and tell you, and I've done this, this is sort of a bare bones kind of like objective approach why this issue is important, and I can get behind those certain statements. I can get behind, and some things the advocates would like me to say I can't say with integrity. So I found myself in a balance of sort of wanting to appear as a good researcher and use that appearance as a type of advocacy, I suppose. So I see that as a tension.
Emma?
Yeah, I don't think advocacy is a dirty word. I've probably been called worse, but I would say that if research is advocacy, it's advocacy with maybe always a standing potential obligation to be a critic as well. And so that I guess tempers the advocacy role in a way that requires some navigation.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It went by so quickly. I really appreciate your thoughts and both sort of theoretical perspective, but also like really detailed examples that you've been using and thinking through that have inspired your own work and practice. And thank you everyone for coming to all the CARE sessions this semester. This is the last one. Please check the CHV website for the fall lineup. It'll be developed sometime in the summer. All right. Thanks all.